President Wayne A.I. Frederick, Dr. Harry Williams, thank you so much for joining me today. I am honored to have you all. And I want to keep this conversational, so if there is a point that you're like, hey, I got something to say, please jump in. We have the experts here for a reason, okay? So we're talking about HBCUs, we're talking about funding them, we're talking about the education pipeline. And first, President Frederick, you are here at Howard University, the Mecca. It's such an important place for Black and brown children to find education and safe spaces. But tell me a little bit about how this opportunity came about and why Howard is important to not only HBCU culture, but to the Black community as a whole.
First, thanks for being here. I think this is a very important topic. Howard is extremely important, I think, to the culture. The history of HBCUs really is a Howard story in many ways. Howard was the only federally funded and federally chartered HBCU. It was actually started by the 17th president of the United States, President Johnson, who was a known misogynist and a known racist. The same day that he signed the charter to start Howard, he basically vetoed the first Reconstruction Acts because he didn't believe that formerly enslaved people moving from the South should get an education. And then the other thing about Howard that's little known is that Howard was actually started as a university. Most of our great universities in America were started as seminaries. So it was a bold ambition in 1867 to start a university primarily for the education of formerly enslaved people moving from the South to study medicine and dentistry and law. Was a very, very bold mission. So I think it's extremely important that Howard participate. And our connection to the community is clear. I mean, even the space that we're in, this is where Brown versus the Board of Education, the mock trials were really experimented on. This is where Thurgood Marshall sat with the rest of the team and observed that argument being framed, looking at all of the issues around whether or not Black children could be educated in the same spaces with white children, why they didn't have to be in segregated spaces. So the connection to the community from the very beginning has continued and will continue, throughout Howard's history.
Yes, I really love that. Thank you for the tidbits, because I didn't even know that about Howard. I knew that about the Founders Library, but I am literally a product of how Howard and HBCU culture pours into the community. I grew up, I didn't attend Howard, I get my degree here, but I attended life here, and I used to have been here for 18 plus years, and so, I'm so excited to talk to both of you today. So, Dr. Harry Williams, tell us a little bit about who you are and the Thurgood Marshall College Fund. Tell us why it's so important, especially now, for our HBCUs to have the funding they need.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be here with you and also to be with the president of Howard University. Thurgood Marshall College Fund, I got chill bumps right now because hearing the fact that Justice Marshall sat in this room and prepared a case that changed America.
Literally.
Brown versus Board of Education, 1954 decision, game changer in this country. And we get up every day at the Thurgood Marshall College Fund. I have the best job in the world. I get to advocate on behalf of 47 public historically Black colleges and universities in this country with the sole purpose of focusing in on our Black students who are attending these institutions to provide opportunities for scholarships that would remove barriers. Believe it or not, African Americans have a lot of barriers out there, and finance is one of those barriers. So scholarships, having the scholarship resources there is so important. It's probably more so now than ever. One point I want to make, without HBCUs, and I heard President Frederick reference this in terms of the boldness of these institutions, there wouldn't be a Black middle class as we know it today, period. Would not be a Black middle class as we know it, because as Dr. Frederick referenced, we had to create our own medical school, we had to create our own law school because they had laws on the books that said we couldn't attend. Justice Marshall was rejected because he couldn't attend an institution in Maryland. But Howard was here for Justice Marshall. So the fact that these institutions are still here and they're still underfunded, America should be just rolling in resources to support these institutions because we provide an uplift, and we've been doing that for over 150 years.
Wow. Ooh, brothers, I done got chills. Just sitting in here in this moment and taking in the fact that these walls held the conversations that we're talking about that changed the world, and hopefully carrying on that torch and continuously changing the world means so much to just be here. Thank you all. Y'all set the stage. Now, President Frederick, Frederick, at Howard University, students receive exceptional education. I mean, I know I'm a product of a student who has received, shout out to my mother, but how does proper school funding in the Black higher ed space directly impact the Black experience and Black wealth? We talked about the Black middle class. What's your take on that as well?
Well, it's significant, and the data shows that. For instance, Howard sends more African Americans to medical school than any other institution in this country, and has produced more Black physicians than any other institution in this country. So if you look at life expectancy right here in Washington, D.C., if you're a Black man in Ward 7 or 8, you live 22 years less than a white woman in Ward 3. And if you don't have Black doctors, there's a significant article that came out just recently that showed that Black doctors in Black communities actually increase life expectancy and increase health outcomes. So it's directly impacted. So if you fund students to come to these institutions, you're funding better care for that community, you're funding generational wealth, you're funding opportunities that otherwise wouldn't exist. And the numbers are very scary in terms of funding. So Howard University over the past 2.5 decades has sent more African Americans from undergrad to STEM PhDs, more than MIT, Stanford, Harvard, and Yale combined. The combined endowment of those 4 institutions, as of probably yesterday, was about $60 billion. Billion. And Howard's endowment is just under $1 billion. So this one institution is diversifying something as important as a STEM PhD area, which is critical. And why is that critical? I'm an example of that. I have sickle cell anemia. I'm homozygous for a chronic illness, which primarily affects people of the African diaspora. And I came here to Howard because there was a sickle cell center, which means that if Ronald Scott, who is a pioneer in sickle cell, didn't start a sickle cell center here, my mom wouldn't have been courageous enough as a nurse to send me to an institution so far away from my home. But she sent me here because there was a sickle cell center here. So it has an impact. Everywhere you look, there's a continuous impact. And that funding is critical, and that's the gap in funding. And the last thing I'll say, I think Harvard's endowment is now about $50 billion. If they use their 5% spending rule, that will produce $2.5 billion every year. That is, they can run 2.5 Howard universities with just 5% of their endowment every year. So if they invest well and they have returns of 10% and more, they could just take half of their returns and fund 2.5 Howard universities. So just think of what America would look like if there were 2.5 Howards.
My goodness. Ooh, them stats just made me mad, honestly. Like, I can understand why this work is so important. Yeah. And even though, like, you turn on any mainstream channel right now, there's going to be somebody talking about how their major company funds an HBCU initiative, but it's still lacking in comparison to these institutions that have been around. How do we continue to make noise about it? In what ways can we as a community even rally and make sure that we're creating momentum around even raising funds? What are some ways that you all really, really encourage as far as our listeners to do and be a part of?
Well, what I think, we have this moment right now that's happening. The very unfortunate incident that took place in 2020 with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor that shook this country and that put a spotlight on the inequities that exist within the African American community. And corporate America responded, the federal government responded, and the question we keep hearing, when is it going to end? When will this attention to our HBCUs end? And I really believe in the core of my being that HBCUs, there may be some type of fatigue when it comes to the question around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but there is no HBCU fatigue. There is no fatigue about the quality of these institutions. There is no fatigue when we have 101 HBCUs. We represent less than 3% of all universities in this country. There are about 4,000 universities in this country, 3%. And we produce more doctors than any of the historically white institutions. And you think about that, the power associated with that. And if you make the investment in these institutions that they need, and they have been underfunded for 150 years, and we're not even close. And a lot of funding that's come our way Yes, during the pandemic, we received more funding than we've ever received, close to $6 billion of new dollars, but that's not enough.
Right.
That's not enough. You got to catch up. When you were behind, it's hard to catch. You got to keep funding, keep pushing this. And what I see in this space, this incredible space where we have an opportunity to keep this spotlight on HBCUs and the quality that's coming out of these institutions. I have 2 boys. Both of them attended Howard University. Both of them graduated. Both of them got jobs, and they were in careers, business students, and had no problems getting jobs because these institutions, they produce nothing but the best. So this is our opportunity here to continue that message in a very positive way. And I'm happy we're on your TV program so your listeners can see and research and really look at, really think about, if you have someone that's of college age, think about an HBCU. I guarantee you won't be disappointed.
It's honestly my biggest regret. Like, no lie, I should have absolutely just continued my life education and gotten my real education at Howard. And maybe, you never know, I can always come back to school, but I think, there is a certain safety that is offered on HBCU campuses that you don't get anywhere else. And I was talking to, I was just having this conversation. Someone said, it was my HBCU experience. It was Angel. Her HBCU experience was like a utopia of safety. And she was like, I'm gonna have to be a minority for the rest of my life. I'm choosing to be in the majority for my schooling, and it makes such a difference. And so I love that you said that. Do you want to add anything about, how we can
I certainly want to follow on. I think we have to also be cautious, because one of the things that we've been tracking is our fundraising against philanthropy for social justice causes. And just as President Williams said, that went up significantly after George Floyd's murder. But the reality is that it has also gone down since. And it has gone down so significantly that today, funding for social justice causes is almost less than it was in 2019, pre-George Floyd's murder. Our HBCU funding is still staying up because I think people are seeing the excellence. And so the way I try to describe that is that a lot of people join the caravan for social justice that our HBCUs are on, but they will leave. So while they're with us, we have to make sure that they fill up the tank, they give us new tires, we get new carburetors, because we know that they're going to leave. And when they leave, we also have to leave them with an impression that that caravan to social justice is critical, and that they must participate, they must come back, and they must be left with a very strong impression that this is the right thing to do. And I am concerned that that right thing to do, once the spotlight goes away, people can go into the shadow of not doing the right thing, and we have to consistently be communicating. So it's not just our responsibility as university presidents or as foundation leaders, but it's our entire community's responsibility to say, we need more black male doctors, right? In 1978, we had more black males in our medical schools than we did in 2015. That number went up after George Floyd's murder, probably because of doing Zoom interviews and the pandemic, not having to actually go to interviews. But that number is also falling again. So we have to be very, very careful, I think, as a community to ensure that these institutions are funded, and it's our collective responsibility.
Yes, I see the same thing in like the creator funds that were given and the black squares that we saw. Like it was this performative, all the way pushed for a passion for the equity of black people and black students and black lives, that now it's like, we still here. What happened? My life didn't go away because, your attention's changed. And it is something that I'm glad that we get to have this conversation, because we need to remind people that, this is not something that we are going to stop working on or stop being loud about. And so I am grateful that we have this. And I want to make sure I get this number right. So I want to say President Frederick, GM, General Motors, has provided more than $1.75 million to support HBCU STEM education and programming since 2017. And so how important is it when we think about the school to wealth pipeline to have partners who are supportive in this way?
Yeah, higher education still is the economic escalator of our time. There's no doubt about it. Yes, there are entrepreneurs and venture capitalists who are going to have startups, but the reality is when you look at the population as a whole, the larger part of the population is going to get there because of the economic escalator that is higher education. And it's critical. On our campus, we have 800 biology majors at any given time. Howard University is the 5th most selective medical school in the country. We received 11,000 applications last year. We'll only enroll 130 students. So our capacity, if we can double the size of that medical school, just as an example, we make a big difference. I told you what we do in STEM, for STEM PhD. So that funding from companies like GM is absolutely critical in terms of getting students on that road, whether it's in engineering or math or science. It is extremely important, and that funding is critical. A lot of our students who come get Pell Grants, which means that on the economic ladder, they don't have all the funds to attend. And then we also think sometimes of just tuition, but we have to think of internships. You know, students in the summer that may have to go live in an expensive place like New York. So it's great that you might get an internship in somebody's lab, but then you've got to foot that bill. We have students that don't have an international experience. A significant number of our students come here without a passport, have never been out of the country. And in this global world that we are living in today and how small it is getting, we have to make sure that we can also afford our students those types of opportunities. So the funding from places like GM is absolutely critical.
Funding, it sounds like funding at every single step is, still missing, and we need pretty much everybody, all hands on deck to ensure that.
Just imagine, there's a school in Baltimore called Johns Hopkins. They get about $1.4 billion from the federal government. Just imagine if $1 billion came to Howard University Medical School. You just heard President Frederick say he got 11,000 applications, but only have 135 seats. Just imagine if the federal government, they make a strategic and very intentional decision and say, we're gonna fund this program, this medical school here, where we get proven results. What would that do for this community? What would it do for our community? It would transform our community significantly.
Yes, and I mean, as a person who knows this work very intimately, what does it mean to have partners like GM, who have this staggering number to give into HBCUs?
That's part of their responsibility. I mean, part of corporate America responsibility is their social responsibility. If they're taking from the community, they need to give back to the community that they're taking the resources from. So that's part of it. So when we have big partners like Apple, Boeing, Medtronic, one of the largest medical supply companies in the world, and they're supporting our institutions, supporting our students, and providing them with amazing opportunities. But that's part of their corporate responsibility, and we have to continue to remind them that you're not giving us anything. This is not charity. You're not giving us anything. We're putting back into the community because we're bringing our talent, and we're also that trusted partner in the community that's going to support the African American community, and that's going to close that wealth gap. That wealth gap is so big between blacks and whites in this country, and our institutions, HBCUs, they are the answer to closing that wealth gap. And by putting the resources there, it will change this country forever.
Y'all are preaching. We're gonna open the doors of the church for the tithes, because this is really good. I want to ask, what are some of the ways that you said we're reminding our corporate partners consistently all about this. So what are some of the ways that the Thurgood Marshall Fund is empowering and making sure that the corporations and the partners are driving solutions to help make sure that HBCUs are funded? What are some of the methods that you use that maybe you would tell other people who are raising money for HBCUs to do themselves?
Well, one of the things, we're unapologetically black.
Come on.
And we don't run from that. We don't run away from that. That's one thing that's in our mission statement. We are very clear on who we're supporting, because that community in this country is still underrepresented in anything you want to put a measuring stick to. And if you want to lift up this country, you got to lift up those who have the least. And part of that responsibility is to try to move people up to the middle class. And one of the things that we just had a big event here last night at the African American Culture Museum, where we rolled out a movie with one of our corporate partners, John Deere, and John Deere looking at farmers, looking at black farmers, and how many black farmers have lost their land because of air property. And that's a big issue, that's a big deal. But reminding them it's their responsibility to put resources back into the community that they're taking the resources from.
You all have been So great today. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for your expertise, your voices, and your expertise and your experience, and the ways that you work with us and for us are just, there's not enough thank yous in the world. But thank you both for serving the way that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.